Hi everyone, it's Mariah Rossell. So we just got done with an amazing weekend at the Rocky Mountain Burning Arts Summit, and it was fabulous. It was so phenomenal. Thank you to everyone that came out and all of the speakers. And one of the things that I had been talking about at the summit was a panel called Enthusiastic Consent in the Arts Communities. And one of the things that came out of this panel, I guess would be the word, was the idea of consent as a conversation. So I had so many wonderful conversations with people at the summit this weekend, and one of the conversations that really struck with me was a conversation with somebody who has been in the community for a long time. And when this person had originally heard about the 11th principle of consent, they weren't quite sure how much they wanted this to be adopted, because the way that it had been discussed was not consent as a conversation, but as a mandate of how we have to do it, and felt like it was just adding more rules and regulations, and this is how you do it, rather than this is how we do things because it's fun for our community. And so that's one of the most amazing things about this idea of having consent as a conversation. So instead of saying consent is how we have to do it, or consent is mandated, but it's how do we start to talk to people about these things in our community? Because the thing is, especially in the Burning Man community, we have so many amazing people, and we're living on the edge. We're doing new things. We're doing things differently, and everybody has different preferences. And the only way that I can know what your preferences are, the only way that I can know what you want, is by having that conversation. And the same thing back, the only way you can know exactly what it is that I want. We may have had these conversations before, but my conversation today may be different. And so, there's long been the quote, the adage in our community of communication is the best lubrication. But why is communication so important? It's because it allows us to feel heard. It allows us to feel safe. It allows us to feel expressive. And what's so important about this is now we can start to say, what are the intricacies? Because what consent looks like to me is different than what consent looks like to you. What is appropriate behavior is going to be different for each person. And so just because that was okay in one situation or with one partner or with one group of people does not mean that that's necessarily appropriate this time. And this isn't to say, well, you don't know anything, and to go into a situation and feel like you're not able to speak your truth or act authentically because you always have to ask for permission. It's not about asking for permission. It's not about not feeling good enough. It's about, bottom line, nobody in our community wants to feel that we hurt another community member accidentally. We don't want to hear the next day that any situation from anybody that, oh my gosh, you did this thing and it hurt me, physically, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, whatever. And so this is why this is such an important conversation, because we all want to feel open and vulnerable and safe as we build a new experimental community. We are building what the standards are, and the thing is, so not only are we figuring out what the standards are and what we want to do as a community, but we're also continually acculturating new people. Our average burn has about 30 to 50% people that have never been to the burn before. And so we have to acculturate all of these new people. So not only do we have to understand what feels safe, sane, consensual, informed consent, and all of these things within ourselves and our own community, we now have to take these ways of being, which are often different ways of being, different ways of operating than the status quo, and now we have to explain them to the new people who are excited and they don't necessarily know the way that we operate, and that's okay. But this is where this idea of consent as a conversation comes in. The only way that they can consent to be a part of our community is by having a conversation and saying, do I even like these principles? Do I even like this way of being? Do I even like this type of community? But they can't really fully consent to being an active participant in our community until they know what we're about, until they engage with us, until they have these conversations. And then they can consent, they can choose to be a part of the community, and they can say, okay, I choose to be a part of this community because I like how the community operates. And we also can say, awesome, we know how this community operates, and so we're going to continue these conversations. And so I think that's really the big thing, is it's an ongoing thing, it's a dialogue, and it's going to change, because not only does what does consent mean to you is going to change, but what does consent as a community is definitely going to be something that changes as well. Because, I mean, at the end of the day, it's still going to be this conversation, but how does this conversation play out, I think is what I'm trying to say, is going to change. Because as we start to create more complex relationships, and one of the things that the 11th principle consent community talks about is this idea of a consent castle. Something that we can build together, we can modify it, we can change it, and it's an ongoing project. This isn't, I ask one time, it's an ongoing relationship, and things can always be modified and changed. But the only way that we know how we can build this, the only way we know we can modify and change it, the only way that we can base this on trust is by having those conversations. And so this was an absolutely wonderful weekend at the Rocky Mountain Burning Arts Summit, talking about that, about consent and about all these other issues. And so I just really appreciate all the people that came out to the summit this weekend. And I look forward to continuing this conversation about consent, because the reason I think it's so important that we talk about consent now is that if we try to do workshops on consent at Burns, they're really hard, because you're in a party atmosphere or a music festival atmosphere, or community building atmosphere, but really the time to focus on the intricacies of what does consent look like is not something that people are really going to focus on. But if we can, yeah, it's exactly like Emily says in the comments, it's too late when we're already in that situation. So it's like, how do we prepare ourselves? We've already started to have these conversations. Now when we get into that situation, especially, now the situation may be we're not sober, or people are looking for immediacy. This is actually a really interesting thing that Tim, one of the other guys that was on the panel with me, discussed. Was he does a lot of work in the kink community. And the idea of actually consent is one of the few places where immediacy is not really effective. Because immediacy is, oh my gosh, this is what I want to do right now. But what he was talking about was actually setting the boundaries up front and then keeping the same boundaries throughout the entire scene. And then if you wanted something different, after that, renegotiate, have that conversation, and then do it later. Because if halfway through you change the consent, you change the boundaries, somebody might not feel like they were actually doing what they wanted to do, because now you might have power and control dynamics, or now you might be in a different headspace, you might have different neurochemicals. And so I think that's a really important thing when we look at Burns, is like, okay, so we've had this conversation beforehand with the community, and now each person has this conversation with themselves and with their friends. And then, this may be a day-by-day thing. Burning Man, if that's what we're talking about, can be a week, 2 weeks long, depending on how long you're out there. And really start to say, okay, what are my boundaries and consent lines for today? Then you can renegotiate. But there's always tomorrow. There's always another opportunity. Because if we're saying, oh my gosh, this is the only opportunity that I ever have, how often are you going to rush into a decision? It's not going to be an informed decision. You might not be able to take personal responsibility and really understand the depth of that. And so really looking at all of our ideas of consent, of, do I know enough to have consent? And then have I had the conversations with myself, with the people I'm playing with? And, you know, a lot of these things come up with sex, but maybe that's not sex. Maybe it's just, how do you want to engage? You know, we talk about photos. Maybe you're on a special diet and you say, you know what, I'm going to this event and I'm going to let these couple things slide for this particular burn. You know, so consent can be all over the board, but really having those conversations and checking in with yourself before you get wrapped up in the emotions, before you get wrapped up in the new neurochemistry, before you may choose to not be sober. And then staying with that until you have that reflective time again, until you can have that conversation with the world around you and with yourself. And so let's just keep having this conversation. And thank you everyone for having these conversations with me. And thank you again for everybody that came out to the Rocky Mountain Burning Art Summit. It was wonderful. And have a lovely evening. Bye-bye.